Lesson 8. A Young Nation is Born. George Washington went back to Mount Vernon at the end of the war. Listen closely to today's read aloud to discover what happened to him next. For the first few years after the Revolutionary War ended, the former British colonies could not seem to agree on anything. They had not yet come up with a name for themselves. Some said they should be called the Union of States. Others liked the sound of the American Nation. Others simply wanted to call themselves by the names of the states in which they lived, Virginians if they lived in Virginia, New Yorkers if they lived in New York, and so on. There was no plan for how they would be governed or ruled, so lots of different people were making up lots of different rules. States were taxing one another unfairly, just like the British had done before the war. What a big mess. George Washington was enjoying life at Mount Vernon with his wife, their children, and grandchildren. At 55, he felt he had served his country well as a commander-in-chief, and he was not looking for any more jobs away from his farm. But 4 years after returning home from the Revolution, Washington was called to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for another big meeting. Do you recognize anyone in these pictures? It's George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. He joined many of the same men with whom he had worked in the Continental Congress at the beginning of the war. These men are called our Founding Fathers, or simply Founders, because they helped found or start our new country. Benjamin Franklin, now 81 years old, was the oldest representative there. George Washington was elected president of the convention or meeting. A president is the person in charge of a large meeting or country. It was called the Constitutional Convention because the men were writing a constitution, a plan for how the new nation could live together peacefully. Do you remember how Washington said that they needed to come up with a plan of how to rule the country without a king? Well, these men were meeting to come up with that plan, which they called the Constitution. Stop arguing, George Washington told the men. We have an important job to do. It was hard work. They met for 4 long, hot months from May to September. The men continued to argue. Some walked out, but most of them stayed until they came up with a good plan or constitution. Their hard work paid off. The rules they wrote that summer, more than 200 years ago, are the ones we still use today. And when our founding fathers left Philadelphia that September, our country had a new name. We, the people of the United States, they wrote. United means combined into one. So now all the states have come together, they are a united or single nation. From then on, the 13 former British colonies were called the United States of America. One thing the representatives discussed that summer was their need for a leader. They decided that a president, chosen by the people, to serve for only a few years, would be better than a king who was not elected and served for his entire lifetime. And guess who they wanted to lead them? You guessed it, George Washington. Once again, he had wanted to settle down at Mount Vernon, but once again, he had been called to serve his country. In 1789, when George Washington left his home in Virginia to become the first president of the United States of America, he had no idea what he was going to do. As the president of the new country, he knew that his presidency would set an example for all future presidents. While president, Washington stayed very busy. He helped organize a permanent national army and navy and set up a national banking system. If something is permanent, it means that it's lasting. It will not go away. Today, our country still has a permanent national army and navy. As president, George Washington lived first in New York City and later in Philadelphia. He worked hard on plans for a city that would be our nation's capital. George Washington personally chose the capital site along the Potomac River, on land that is between Maryland and Virginia. A capital city is the city where leaders gather to govern the entire country. The word capital can also mean an uppercase letter. This image shows Washington, D.C. as it looks today. This capital city would not be in any state, so no state could say that it was in charge of the country. The capital city was designed to have a house in which the president and his family would live. It would also have many government buildings. George Washington was no longer president when the capital city was finally built, but the city was named in his honor. It was called Washington, D.C. D.C. stands for District of Columbia. After serving as President of the United States for 8 years, George Washington packed up and headed home to Virginia. He died at Mount Vernon at the end of 1799, about 2.5 years later. A patriot, a founder of our nation, a military commander, and our first president, Washington has rightly been called the father of our country. Many places have been named for him. Monuments and statues have been built in his honor. You can even find his picture on our money, both on a paper bill and on a coin. George Washington's picture is on the $1 bill and the quarter. What did George Washington do after the war ended? The read aloud tells us that George Washington was a founder, or founding father, of our country. What did these founders do? If Washington loved Mount Vernon so much, why do you think he left again, first going to Philadelphia for another meeting, and then becoming president of the country? Why do you think Washington felt it was important to have a permanent or lasting army and navy? The author of the read aloud said that George Washington is called the father of our country. What reasons did the author give for calling George Washington the father of our country? If you had the chance to meet George Washington, what would you say to him or ask him? In the read aloud you heard, George Washington was elected president of the convention or meeting. Say the word president with me. President. A president is in charge of a meeting or a country. Every 4 years, the United States elects a president for the country. Tell about a president whom you have heard about or seen pictured. Try to use the word president when you tell about him or her. What's the word we've been talking about? If you were president of the United States, what would you do as president? Describe one thing you would do as president.